In the Middle Ages, death was a profoundly important and spiritually significant event. Funerals in medieval Spain featured dramatic displays of public weeping and sorrow, but one practice in particular, favored by women up until the early 13th century, is particularly strange to the eyes of modern observers. Today on Real Crusades History, we'll discuss this practice and try to grasp it from the perspective of the medieval era. The year is 1211. The place, the Kingdom of Castile. In modern-day Spain, King Alfonso VIII's son, Prince Fernando, has just died. Alfonso is inconsolable, and the whole kingdom goes into a state of mourning. Funerary services are held at the royal monastery near Burgos, where the 22-year-old prince's body will be interred. Knights don sackcloth or hair shirts. The elderly sprinkle their heads with ashes. Mourners gathered for the funerary rites weep publicly and display their grief with unreserved sorrow. The king's daughter, Princess Berenguela, assumes the traditionally feminine role of chief mourner and caretaker of the dead. In taking on this role, Berenguela was performing a prestigious function for the royal family. She was in charge of the royal treasury and directed the affairs of the funeral. She also made a dramatic display of the family's grief, weeping openly over her brother's body. She may even have taken part in an age-old display of sorrow that was, by now, dying out in the Iberian Peninsula. At the funeral of Prince Fernando, virgins scratched at their cheeks to the point of drawing blood. This was a very old form of public mourning in Spain, dating back to the Visigoths, if not earlier. Saint Isidore mentions the practice. He regarded the blood as evidence of the soul's anguish and associated its color with the purple clothing and flowers used at burials. The practice was not limited to widows and family members. Women are reported to have torn at their cheeks and clothing in 1134 during the funeral of one of Aragon's greatest kings, Alfonso the Battler. Nor was the practice limited to Spain. Cheek rending was part of a larger Mediterranean mourning tradition that stretched back to the ancient world. One medical treatise describes ointments used in Salerno to heal the cheeks of women after a funeral. And there were other occasions, aside from funerals, when women engaged in this practice. A woman who had been violated would scratch at her own face to the point of drawing blood. This physical sign, along with a formal allegation, prompted the community to investigate the matter and seek justice. Historian Heath Dillard elaborates, "A medieval Castilian woman tore her face when she suffered deep torment, and a victim of ravishment doubtless scratched her cheeks instinctively in reaction to the misfortune that had befallen her. A woman might nevertheless forego tearing her face to hide the dreadful fact, or to maintain that, although forcibly abducted, she had managed to escape without being violated. The veracity of a woman who accused a man but failed to claw her face was highly questionable, and in the experience of townsmen, there might be grounds for dismissing her complaint." To modern observers, such standards of proof might seem bizarre, even unfair, but graduate student Rachel Q. Welsh of New York University thinks that we should view such legal statutes as primarily practical in nature. During this period, scratched cheeks were so closely associated with profound emotional turmoil in a woman that their presence was highly indicative that she'd suffered severe trauma. A rough equivalent might be the presence of PTSD, which for moderns tends to point to a subject having undergone some horrific ordeal. By the early 13th century, town authorities began to eliminate funerary extravagance and displays of extreme grief, including the practice of cheek scratching. In Zamora, cheek rending was limited to widows, daughters, and servants of the deceased. Soria permitted only widows to wear sackcloth and tear at their faces over a grave. Other women were allowed to weep and moan, but were prohibited from clawing at their faces. The law code of Alfonso X of Castile condemns excessive mourning and specifically denounces the scratching of cheeks. Moderns might look back on these dramatic displays of grief as forced or somehow insincere, but we should remember that medieval people had very different assumptions from our own. Ostentatious displays of sorrow at funerals were commonplace throughout the world for many centuries. Such behavior must have seemed natural, instinctive even, to period mourners.
Lay the sword at the altar, kneel and pray. faith is that a soul black with sin